Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. We don't have too much time this morning, so I want to make sure that we leave enough time for everybody to talk about their chapters and then for us to leave time at the end for questions. But I'm Summer Harlow. I'm the Associate Director of the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas, and this is the second webinar that we're doing related to the publication of a new ebook called Worlds of Journalism: Safety, Professional Autonomy, and Resilience Among Journalists in Latin America. This was published by the Knight Center, by the Department of Journalism and Media Management in the School of Communication at the University of Miami, and the Center for Global Change in Media at the University of Texas at Austin, which is also where the Knight Center is located. And I have put the link to the ebook in the chat. It's available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, so I hope you all download it. I've also put a link to the previous webinar that we did. It was held about a week and a half ago, and it was in Spanish, and it featured authors from different countries. We had Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, Argentina, Ecuador, and Chile in that one. And so today we're lucky to have different countries represented. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Celeste Gonzalez de Bustamante, who is the founding director of the Center for Global Change in Media here at the University of Texas, and one of my co-editors on the ebook. It was also edited by Sally Hughes at the University of Miami. And Celeste, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Summer, and thank you everyone for joining us this beautiful day. And I just want to thank the Knight Center for giving us this platform to discuss the important findings and implications of the results of this third round of Worlds of Journalism study, which includes, for Latin America, 11 countries. And as Summer mentioned, they are published in this newly released ebook that you can download for free on the Knight Center's website. I also wanted to start with, before I get into the bios of all of our distinguished panelists, a comment that the director of the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas, Rosenthal Alves, wrote in the ebook. And he wrote that, to my knowledge, there's never been a comprehensive census of journalists in the region. In this book, you'll find one of the most complete studies ever published about the status of journalism in Latin America. So it's an obviously significant time to be doing the research, significant research. I really encourage everyone to go and download the ebook that is in Spanish, it's in English, and in Portuguese. So with us today, we have five distinguished panelists here to talk about the results from the study in Venezuela. We have Carlos Arcia Calderon, a full professor in the College of Sociology and Communication at the Universidad de Salamanca. He is a specialist in digital communication and data analysis. He's a member of international projects on social media and hate speech, and he holds a PhD from Complutense University and edits the journal Disertaciones. Here to talk about the results from the study in Peru, we have Lourdes Cueva Chacon. She is an assistant professor at the School of Journalism and Media Studies at San Diego State University. She received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and earned her Master's of Arts in Communication from the University of Texas at El Paso and her Master of Science in Information Science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Here to talk about the results from the El Salvador study, we have Summer Harlow, the Associate Director of the Center for Journalism in the Americas here at UT Austin. She earned her PhD in journalism and an MA in Latin American Studies here at UT, and her research examines the intersections of journalism, activism, and technology in Latin America. Currently, she is the associate editor for the academic journal Journalism Studies. We also have Janara Nicoletti, who will be talking about the results from the study in Brazil. She is a researcher and lecturer at the Digital Methods Department at the University of Saigon and a freelance lecturer at Deutsche Welle Academy. She is a co-leader of the Latin American and Caribbean region of the Journalism Safety Research Network and a researcher associated with the Erich Brost Institute for International Journalism in Germany and the Observatory of Journalistic Ethics in Brazil. Her research focuses on journalists' work precarity and safety, journalism quality, and ethics. And we also have here today to talk about Bolivia, Mireya Marquez Ramirez, a professor of journalism studies and media theory at the Department of Communication at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City. She received her doctoral degree in media and communications from Goldsmiths, University of London. Her research includes media capture, media systems in Latin America, comparative journalism cultures, journalistic roles, journalistic professionalism and labor, newsmaking processes, journalist safety, and beat journalism, especially health and sports journalism. Thank you all so much for being here today. We'll have 90 minutes for our webinar, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So please feel free as we near the end of our discussion to put your questions in the chat. So to get started, let's put these studies into a little bit of context. Maybe you could each talk about what the study says about the current state of journalism in the country where you gathered surveys for the Worlds of Journalism study, and were there any findings that were surprising? Maybe we could start with Carlos Arcia Calderon, who did the study and led the study in Venezuela. Carlos?
Thank you so much, Celestina and Summer, for the introduction. And I did the study in Venezuela, as you mentioned, together with two colleagues, Maximiliano Frias and David Blanco. And we had, let's say, some surprising findings because Venezuela is a special case and it's now in the focus of all the world because of the recent news. It's important to mention that the surveys that we conducted just before that. So this study was conducted between 2021 and 2024. So situation today has changed significantly, and if we probably pose the questions today, we're going to find different answers. However, the first thing is that it was very difficult to talk to the journalists because most of them were afraid of giving answers to scholars, and sometimes, especially when they work for media that had funding from the state, they just refused to talk to us. So that's just an important thing that we found there. But even knowing this limitation, we could find some interesting results regarding the perceptions the journalists have about the work they conduct. And one of the probably most interesting variables that we asked was about the perception of the autonomy, to what degree, to what extent they considered they could conduct their work with autonomy, for example, to select the news or to give some framing or focus to the news. So very surprising, the average of their answer was, let's say, relatively high, or at least was very similar to other countries of the world. So this is interesting because when we ask them about other important variables of the world, such as, let's say, the safety, if they have had some threats, or the money they earn for living, we see very low answers related to low income, for example. They were precarious in the work, and they also were victims of a lot of different threats. And if we compare that to other countries of Latin America and also to other countries of the world, they have worse conditions. And also, when we ask them about the perception they have about the media freedom, that perception was very low. So they this is the interesting and the paradox also of the answer we had from the journalists. They consider they are in a country where the media freedom is low, but still they feel they have some autonomy in their work. So we have some explanations for that in terms of first, many of the journalists work for digital media, native digital media, which means there are media that are not controlled completely by the state or by other by large companies. So in this small media, probably they have this kind of autonomy. And the other answer, I mean, the other explanation we have for these answers is that sometimes just as journalists, we feel if we don't have how to compare, we feel that we have a lot of autonomy because we don't have the way to compare. So we haven't been in another in a system where you have a lot of freedom. If you get used to this lack of freedom, then you consider that your freedom is high. So this might happen also in some, especially of the young journalists that have only lived these last years of control in Venezuela. So these are the main surprising findings that we have from Venezuela.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm going to be the teacher in the room and just call on folks. Mireya, maybe you could answer, and then we'll go to Lourdes and then Janara.
Thank you, Celeste. Well, in the case of Bolivia, we are very excited because for the first time, Bolivia was included in the World of Journalism study after 3 rounds. We managed to do it from Mexico City because my co-investigator, Victor Quintanilla, was a PhD there, but he was also a journalist, and that was incredibly useful along with my other colleague, Miguel Angel Flores. So they both gathered the data in about 1 year. So I want the audience to know that gathering interviews with journalists is never easy. These are very busy people, and we have to follow a very strict sampling protocol. So we managed to interview 401 journalists across all departments, including major hubs like La Paz and Santa Cruz. And for me, the most striking thing was that we found a quite veteran workforce with an average age of 45 years and 17 years of professional experience, and also predominantly male, but we are going to talk a little bit of that later. But at the same time, our sample, which was representative, highlighted significant gaps in representation because only 30% of the surveyed journalists are women. And despite the country's high indigenous population, only 10% of the surveyed participants felt or belong to an ethnic group. And I think that's quite challenging for a diverse workforce in a country which is quite diverse. So in that sense, we did find that the Bolivian newsrooms tend to be, again, male, mestizo, and not necessarily indigenous. So one of the first thing is like how representative or how inclusive the topics will be, which takes me to the next surprising finding, which is the neutrality. We found journalists are very normative in their perceptions, and they try to attach to objectivity and neutrality too much, perhaps to avoid trouble in a highly polarized political environment. So, well, for now, I think those are the main findings in Bolivia.
Thank you, Mireya. Lourdes. And then we'll go to Summer and Janara.
Thank you. Thank you, Celeste, and thank you to the Knight Center for organizing this webinar. I wanted to also acknowledge my co-authors, especially Lilian Kanashiro, who's the or the principal investigator. She's at Universidad de Lima, but also Jessica Retis at University of Arizona, and Dan Manso in Mexico. in general, for Peru, I would say that the study reveals and confirms something that we had seen coming, especially after the pandemic, and it's the precarity in the labor conditions of Peruvian journalists, especially outside of Lima, the capital. Just so people can get an idea of that, not even 2 out of every 10 journalists who participated in the survey work full-time for journalism. So less than 2 or less than 20% of the journalists, for the journalists, journalism is their full-time job. So that means that they have to either work for several outlets or compensate their income doing something different than journalism. And I think that's important. We saw again, like coming out from the pandemic or during the pandemic, how precarious was the labor, especially radio reporters, radio journalism. And the study confirms that. And the other thing is that Peru is at the bottom of the list in terms of women representation in the profession. Only 27% of the women, of the journalists that were interviewed for the study were women. And we knew that women are underrepresented in the profession, but I didn't know how bad it was. And it doesn't look like it maybe if you just see around, because there are a lot of women in TV, and so you can see female faces, but they're in management and other areas of journalism, the representation is very low. I know we're going to probably talk more about that. And something that is interesting is that we don't, reporters didn't mention the high levels of fear in terms of their safety. And this is interesting. The surveys were conducted between 2021 and 2024, and 2025 has been the worst year in, I think, 20 years in journalism. We ended up the year with 4 people dead, 4 reporters dead, and at some point I would like to acknowledge them if it's possible. But those are the main findings from Peru.
Thank you, Lourdes. And then we'll stay with the Spanish-speaking countries and go to Janara. Summer.
So for El Salvador, the situation there is very similar to what Carlos was describing. We had difficulty in getting people to agree to do the survey. The journalists were hesitant because of the fact that El Salvador has been living under a state of emergency since, what's the year? I'm trying to blank. Since March 2022, or a state of exception. And so under this state of exception, there have been a lot of constitutional rights and due process protections that have been suspended. So that, and the president is the self-proclaimed coolest dictator in the world, right? Nayib Bukele. So all of that together, I think, has really contributed to this this context where journalists are really operating under extraordinary political pressure. They all, well, not all of them, but a lot of them mentioned the surveillance, the fear of retaliation, limited access to public information. And so journalists really, in this study and in this chapter, you'll see that they describe an increasingly authoritarian environment that shapes their daily practice. Still, what's striking and surprising, I guess, is that despite all of these pressures, journalists still really showed strong professional values. They prioritized watchdog reporting and holding power to account and the need to inform citizens, even when the risks are high. And so there was this tension between that strong internal professional identity to serve the public and to hold power to account. And then on the other hand, these severely constrained external conditions that really made being a journalist difficult. I think some other things that came out of this is also this idea that journalists believe they have autonomy, like in Venezuela, to choose what stories they cover and to frame them in the way that they choose. Yet, despite the fact that more than half said they have this professional autonomy, when they look at media freedom generally for the country, the overwhelming majority said that there is little to no freedom at all. And so then the question becomes, how do they maintain that professional identity? How do they continue to do that watchdog role when they don't actually see any kind of um, media freedom in their country? And I think those are the main things that I wanted to mention.
Well, now talking about Brazil, thank you very much for the invitation. I am representing a team of around 10 researchers from different parts of Brazil, and it was a very interesting study that mobilized a lot of people because Brazil is a continental country. And as other colleagues said, we have several difficulties to gather answers from journalists because journalists don't have time. It's very complicated. Our sample, what I am talking now, is a group of journalists that represent what we call the elite of journalists in Brazil. So we are talking about those journalists that have the opportunity to work 100% or more than 50% of their time as journalists. And this is not the reality in the whole country, especially because we have a legislation that allows journalists working 5 hours per day and then work in other functions. So journalism, even if you are a journalist and you feel really committed with your profession, to survive, you need to go try to find other type of income. So considering this group of journalists, we have a high education level, people with well established in the profession, let's think in 10 years in the profession. And considering this context, what took our attention was the level of self-censorship. 55% of journalists in Brazil, they said that they self-censor themselves as a way to protect themselves from the risks that they face. And when we think about self-censorship, this is something that is hard to acknowledge and say out loud that you are practicing this type of censorship. So if we talk about 50% of journalists that realized it and said, I am practicing self-censorship with frequency, we imagine that we have a higher number of professionals that do that without acknowledge the situation. And we think that this is the reflect of the political situation in Brazil. We collected the data in 2023. That was a period when Brazil was changing government from Jair Bolsonaro's government, a far right-wing politician who used attacks against journalists as a strategy of mobilization and trying to legitimize the press, to govern the country. And also we had a period when we were starting a new government. And then we think that this is a period where journalists were still suffering a lot of influences of this period of, it wasn't an authoritarian regime, but we had a type of pressure that came from the government, and journalists suffered a lot of attacks from politicians to other people. And then this is something that we saw that it's huge, something that we found that is different that we were expecting. And the perception of media freedom in Brazil is very low, 12%. And we could say that also the freedom in selecting the news stories was less than 50%, and the freedom to decide which aspects of story should be emphasized was 55%. So journalists in Brazil, we saw that they don't have too much freedom as we expected, especially considering their profiles and their experience in the field. So this is very concerning considering the state of media in Brazil. And we won't talk about precarity, other things that it was also well known in other studies.
Thank you all. I I'm glad that you mentioned, Janata, the issue of what journalists were talking about who were surveyed. So this is across the board because there generally is a very relatively high level of training. At least most of the journalists who were surveyed across the board throughout the region say they have some professional training related to journalism. I wondered if you could all talk about this level of training and how that relates to their on-the-ground circumstances, given the levels of precarity, technological shifts, violence in the region, and their ability to stay safe. They might receive some professional training, but are there gaps in that training and perhaps where the needs are? And then maybe we could just follow the same order that we did the first round of questions.
Should I begin?
Yes, please, Carlos, go ahead.
Okay, well, in terms of training, for the case of Venezuela, we have a very, very, very high level of training among the journalists, which means that almost all the journalists that we interview had at least a college degree. And most of it in the field of communication. And this is just because in the case of Venezuela, there are a lot of colleges and public and private institutions offering this kind of degrees. Um, and also because for the law in Venezuela is that if you want to work as a journalist, you have to have a previous degree. So for respecting the ethical and the formal law, you have to have this degree. So that is why we were not surprised that most of them had this training. However, this training is just a general training, could be in journalism or communication or in related disciplines, but they are not. They probably don't have this specialization for, let's say, for example, economic journalists or scientific journalists or this kind of thing. So this is a gap that we still have in Venezuela, let's say, the specialization of the journalists. When we look at the relationship of their training with other potential variables, it was difficult to find any relationship just because we have very few cases in which they don't have any formal training. So we cannot draw any conclusion or I mean, we don't have any formal data that can tell a little bit about that. But we suppose that the more training they have, especially if they have specialized training, the more they can resist to the threats and aggression that they suffer. Um, what is true is that many of the journalists that had higher levels of training, let's say they have a postgraduate level, they have left the country. So for very specialized journalists, was easier to leave the country. So they are now in exile. So that's a reality that cannot be completely reflected in our surveys, in our data, but that is probably an explanation of why we have many of them with a degree, but most of them without any specialization. And those that have left the country probably have more skills to face special situations, not only in terms of safety, but also in terms of precarity, because there is this traditionally in Venezuela there has been a relationship between the level of education, also the level of income, and so probably that also helps journalists to have a more consolidated employment when they have higher education.
Thank you, Carlos. Lourdes, what is the situation with training and on the ground circumstances for journalists?
Thank you. I think Mireya was next in the order, but it's okay.
Sorry,
if you don't mind.
Gotta remember my
yes.
order.
So in general, in Peru, 86% of the reporters or journalists interviewed reported they have some sort of higher education, which is high. It's similar to the rest of the region. There are not necessarily big concerns in terms of education and training. I would say they are not associated, directly associated to labor precarity. I would say higher education is relatively accessible in Peru. We have maybe not the best, but a large network of public universities. And public in Peru means literally free, not like in other countries. But the association that I would make, and it's a little bit similar to what Carlos was saying in terms of specialization. When you look at the roles that journalists consider that they are the ones that they have to perform, I'm happy to see like in other places the compromiso, the commitment to be the representatives of the voiceless and watchdogs and so on. So they seek social change. But if you look in terms of what the country has been going through in terms of political turmoil, we have had political crisis in the past 10 years. And we had 7 presidents in 5 years or 7 years, I forget. We're going right now through a possible, again, change in the presidency. Just 3 months before the next presidential elections. But if you look at, there are a couple of questions that we asked in the survey about political issues, and less than 40% of the journalists consider that is their role to engage people in political participation or encourage people to engage in political participation. And then also less than 50% or around 50% consider that their role is to shape political opinion. And this might be, if you think about shaping political opinion, it could be misinterpreted, right? But the way we wanted to ask the question is how much we encourage or we are part of the civic education in our country. And less than 40% of journalists consider that is a role that they have to perform. And I think that's important, and it might be a relationship. There might be a relationship between education and that specialization. Of course, aside from other, political pressures and pressures in general that they might fear for. But I think that's the main connection that I can make in terms of training in general and journalistic roles in Peru. Thank you.
Now, Mireya.
Thank you. Well, Bolivian journalists demonstrate a high level of professionalization through formal education. 91% of Bolivian journalists have received journalism training. However, just let's remember that, as occurs in the rest of Latin American countries, in most of them at least, Bolivian universities do not offer journalism as a standalone undergraduate degree, but they are typically a specialization or a series of subjects or minors, as you call it in the US, of the broader social communication program. So a lot of us, instead of having degrees in journalism like in Chile, have in social communication with an emphasis on journalism. Well, having said that, this is a good academic foundation. It is a critical asset in a media landscape where professionals always must navigate complex sociopolitical dynamics and pressure. because despite this high level of baseline education, the ground reality is still like challenging. Journalists in Bolivia frequently, like occurred in the rest of the region, targeted by verbal attacks. For example, 19% suffers from hate speech and public stigmatization by authorities. We actually asked this specific question just for Bolivia, like how often they are stigmatized by political authorities. We were the only country to ask this question. And I think like 1 in 5 journalists reported being attacked by political authorities, which is a lot in my view. In terms of physical and tactical safety, Bolivian journalists are among the most proactive in the region. That is also a surprising finding for me regarding specialized preparation. For example, 71% of Bolivian journalists have sought safety training or adopted security protocols, the highest rate of safety training adoption reported among the participating Latin American countries. And I think this indicates that our professionals are acutely aware of the risks that are inherent in their work, and they actively seek technical solutions to mitigate threats while reporting. However, there is a clear gap in how this training translates into actual protection against digital and structural shifts. While physical violence, for instance, is less common than in other regions, digital threats and surveillance affect 11% of our journalists, like 1 in 10 is affected by digital threats and surveillance. This suggests that the current training in universities perhaps is either heavily focused on physical safety or not equipping professionals to deal with digital threats. And as I said before, because the workforce is more veteran than young, where the average is 45 years old, they are potentially more vulnerable to these emerging technological forms of intimidation and tracking. Another significant gap is the inclusivity of training and professional opportunities. The workforce, because it remains predominantly male and non-indigenous, this indicates that professional training and entry into the field are not equally accessible to all sectors of society. That's why indigenous communicators or alternative media are at most risk. Like future training initiative must evolve to actively recruit and support these marginalized groups to bridge their demographic and representational divide. And finally, I would like to say that while training is apparently robust, it is being applied with a cautious professional culture. Like Bolivian journalists often prioritize neutrality, like 87%, over the traditional watchdog role. We received 73% of support, the second lowest in the region. So this suggests that the future of journalism education in Bolivia must focus not just on the technical safety and objectivity and neutrality like as professional tenets, but also on empowering journalists to safely fulfill like the watchdog role, their democratic roles, to be, as we all want, like critical monitors of powers, especially in this age of political polarization.
So El Salvador, like the other countries in Latin America that are included in this study, has very high levels of education among journalists. 95% of the journalists that we survey had at least a bachelor's degree in journalism or communications, which is important, right? That I think that relates to the levels of professionalization. It relates to the fact that nearly 90% of journalists said that they, followed the professional ethical standards. And so all of that is valuable, but in a context in El Salvador where press freedom is under attack, where journalists are constantly being, threatened and harassed, what they really need is safety training, right? And one of the things that we know is that El Salvador had the highest level of safety training among the journalists included in Latin America. 75% had undergone some kind of of safety training. But what we also know that the threats that journalists are facing in El Salvador are coming not from arrests or abductions or, office raids, the kinds of physical attacks that we typically think of. They happen, but what really the issue is the hate speech. It's 65% of journalists said that they had experienced hate speech. 60% said their work had been publicly discredited. 42% said that they had been surveilled. 30% or so had been hacked or had their social media accounts blocked. And so there's a lot of this, the digital discourse really is where a lot of these threats are coming from. And in El Salvador, we also asked exactly where the threats are coming from. And what we found, and I think that this perhaps is a little bit, we asked additional questions about the threats that maybe weren't asked in most of the countries. But because of the state of exception, because of the fact that so many journalists are going into exile, because of the threats coming from Bukele and from the government, we wanted to know really where the threats were coming from against journalists. And what we found is that, sorry, I was trying to look up the exact number, that 30% said that the threats and harassment were coming from the president. 39% said they were coming from the Legislative Assembly, 32% from politicians, and 45% from officials. And what's really notable is that just 11% were coming from gangs, right? Or organized crime. And that's really what people for so long have associated El Salvador with, as being, the source of the threats and the source of violence and harassment against journalists. But really what we see here is that it's coming from the government. And nearly half said that the threats were coming from opinion leaders on social media. Or about 59% said they were coming from the president's supporters and allies. And so we really see this culture of digital violence and culture of verbal violence against journalists, that is presenting major obstacles for them to do their jobs. And so because of that, 69% said they were concerned about their physical well-being, but 83% said they were concerned about their emotional and mental health. So I think that really what this tells us is that we need to think more about providing digital security and surveillance protection for these journalists, especially because so many of them had been surveilled using the Pegasus. The government had installed Pegasus, and many journalists found it on their phones, unfortunately. So we also need physical safety protocols, mental health awareness, because the problem really isn't just a lack of training or a lack of professional education. Is perhaps that the training isn't necessarily aligned with this high-risk context in which these journalists are working.
In the Brazilian case, we have one of the highest level of training is around 95, 97%. And when we think about formal education, we have 93% of journalists who have at least a bachelor's degree, and around 30% of journalists, they have a master's degree. So is a well-educated group of professionals. We have it as not an obligation like in Venezuela. Legislation doesn't require that you have a bachelor's degree to work as a journalist, but in the past it was necessary. Till 2009, it was obligated to have a bachelor's degree in journalism to act as a journalist. Now it's not a requirement anymore, but it's a practice in the journalistic industry. Even independent media, they require it. So it justifies the high level of education. But when we compare the high level of education and try to observe, for example, safety trainings, considering the high amount of people that suffer legitimization, discrediting, publicly discrediting, demeaning of or hateful speech, and other types of vigilance and attacks against their work or even their family members, we see that only just over a third of journalists have some type of training in safety. And this is a concerning figure because we have a huge amount of people that are exposed to digital threats and even physical threats, and we don't see this type of training being something that the journalists receive it. And it is not in our survey, but in other studies we can see that most of journalists, they have this type of training by themselves. That is not the news organization who pays, but a third NGO, or they go and try to do it by themselves. It is very good, but we don't see much support to have this type of training. And also training to use different technologies, etc., is something that we see that is missing according to other surveys that we have been conducting in Brazil. So we have a very well-educated group of journalists, but when we think specifically in training to protection mechanisms and other stuff, it's still missing, I think, like all countries that we are talking here.
Thank you, Yanara. Several of you mentioned gender inequities and disparities that came out in your research, and just across the board, women made up about half or almost half of the participants in Brazil, El Salvador, Mexico, and Venezuela, but only about 1/3 or less in the cases of Bolivia, Chile, Costa Rica, and Peru. So based on your research, can you tell us how gender influences the conditions and experiences of journalists, female, male, or non-binary? And maybe we can start with Lourdes.
Yes, thank you. So like I said at the beginning, we are at the bottom of the table in terms of women representation in the profession. And just to encourage people to download the ebook, you will see that at the beginning of the ebook, there are several tables that have comparisons across all the countries in the study, which are 11. And so you can see how all the countries compare. And then you have, of course, specific chapters for each of the countries. So download the ebook. And so yes, it's only 27% of the reporters who participated in the survey were female. We have 0 non-binary, or that were not female or male. Peru in general is a very conservative country, and you can see also reflected in this. It's not that there were no opportunities or were no options to be open about that, but we weren't able to record any aside for male or female. In the women in the sample are only 27%. What comes with this is that there's women reporters show that they had less support and not had as good labor conditions as the men in the sample. So for instance, only 34% of female journalists said that they work under a stable contract, compared to 42% of men. So labor conditions, again, are not the best, but if you compare women and men, women have even less better conditions. There are other problems that come with that. So for instance, female journalists reported less support in all categories. Especially they got less support coming from journalist organizations, and then less support coming from management. So only 62% of women, so a little bit more than the half, reported that they had support from management positions, but more than 3/4 of men reported that they had support from management. And so this is very important. Just the population in Peru is half and half, almost half and half, and this is an indicator that women might not have the best opportunities to participate. That also means that women issues or under other underrepresented communities' voices are also not present in the media. We had in this current administration been 3 presidents in the current presidential period, but in general, there's been a fight against DEI as well, and what is called the gender ideology, or la ideología de género. And so there been efforts, some have come to fruition, to remove sexual education, for instance, from schools. So in general, the country is going toward a more conservative side. And usually, it's not always the case, but women bring a lot of these issues to the discussion, the public discussion. Other thing that have happened is that, and it's not part of this study, but it also other things that we follow in terms of research is the increase on attacks to women in media, and that's also worrisome in general for the group.
Thank you, Lourdes. Mireya, you also mentioned these inequities in Bolivia.
Yes, exactly. Well, Bolivian journalism exhibits several distinct gender disparities that I feel are impacting the demographic makeup of the newsrooms, the longevity of careers, especially the specific types of professional risk encountered by women. So based on the survey here, there are key findings that I would like to share regarding these gender inequalities. First, the underrepresentation of women in the workforce. As I had said, Bolivia has one of the lowest proportions of female journalists in the study, with women representing only 35% of the participants. And this is significantly lower than countries like Brazil, El Salvador, or Mexico, where women make up nearly half of the journalistic workforce. And this can also indicate that they were not prepared to answer our survey. The method we employed was like a Zoom survey, like we are doing right now. So we would interview them virtually, but face to face. So either they were not prepared to answer our survey, or there were no available women on those newsrooms, or they did not fit the sampling and interviewing criteria of having 50% of their time assigned to journalism, or earning 50% of their salary as a journalist. So there are a number of reasons why we do not have enough women in our sample, but I think it's quite telling that it's only 35% of the participants. Another thing we found is an early exit phenomenon. There is a significant age gap between genders in Bolivian newsroom. On average, women journalists tend to be 7 years younger than their male counterparts. 39 years old on average for women versus 46 for men. This gap can suggest that gendered norms that may lead to women leaving the profession earlier or experiencing a devaluation of their work as they age. So the fact that the women were a lot younger means they are in the early ranks of the profession. Another thing we found was this contractual insecurity. Men in Bolivia hold a higher percentage of full-time contracts when compared to women, and specifically, while the region averaged nearly 50% without full-time contracts, like my colleagues have said, in Bolivia, it is 61% of men and 54% of women who work without the security of a permanent full-time arrangement. So I think Peru and Bolivia have share a lot of characteristics. Ecuador is not here right now, but it would be interesting to compare with Ecuador as well. And another thing in terms of risk was the prevalence of workplace bullying. Although the overall incidence of physical attacks in Bolivia is lower than the regional average, still there are risks. Women in Bolivia report higher levels of concern regarding emotional and mental well-being. And across the region, female respondents reported significantly higher levels of workplace bullying and sexual harassment than male respondents. And I think that's a very worrying thing. Safety protocols should have gender perspective and should take into account that not all the protocols work the same for men and women. Thank you.
One of the interesting things about El Salvador is that about 47% of the survey respondents were women, which is fantastic, right? Still not quite 50-50, but it's close. Partly that could be because we did have a higher number of journalists working for digital native news sites. We know that digital native news sites, many of them in Latin America, are founded by women and tend to have a gender perspective. So that could have been part of the reason why we did have more women in our sample than some other countries. But at the same time, we still see differences, right? The women, on average, journalists in El Salvador had about 12 years of experience and were about 36 years old. Women were younger and had less years of experience than men and than the average. They also made less than the men. They were in lower positions in the newsroom. Most tended to be more in the reporting roles rather than in the management roles. And they just, across the board, we see that whatever the case may be, for the most part, women had more precarious labor positions than the men did. They also had fewer women had full-time contracts than the men. But at the same time, we also see that it's not just labor that was precarious, but also just, when we see higher levels of online harassment among women. And we know from other studies that we've done in El Salvador and just in Latin America generally that that type of online harassment against women is often sexist and sexualized. Women also expressed greater concerns about their personal safety, had higher levels of mental stress and higher emotional toll. So while more or less these what we see about gender disparities in El Salvador kind of mirror what we see throughout the rest of the region, I do think that the context of political polarization definitely is going to intensify these risks for women, for LGBTQ plus journalists. Journalists who identify as non-binary, although within our sample we didn't have any that identified as such. But again, from other studies that we've done in El Salvador, we know that those who identify as non-binary or as gender diverse face greater vulnerability with little institutional supports.
In the case, in Brazilian case, we see here the gender disparity is huge in different aspects. We have now in our survey 50.34% of respondents are women. So we have 50-50 case. It's a lower number of other studies, and when we think before the pandemic, the number of women in the media industry were higher. So we now have 50%, but it was around 60% of women journalists working in the media industry, and we could say that it's also it's also relative to the education number, educational situation in Brazil, because more women they have higher education. And then it's something that we see as that we can compare and associate to be certain. So the most problem is, even if we have more educated journalists, women journalists, they are the most people that have master's degree or doctoral degree. They are still in lower positions. So the number of journalists, women journalists in managerial roles are lower than men, and then it consequently they receive less than men. Depending their role, they work harder, but they receive less. They have a low number of women journalists working with full contracts also are lower than men. And when we think about their mental health, this is something that really gets concerning. Around 90% of women journalists say they have fear by their emotional health, and we have 80.6% of women journalists that say they feel stressed at work. So in Brazil, this number is big for both genders, but women they have the highest concern of mental well-being. They are most exposed to some digital attacks, and they also have the situation that their working conditions, when they compare, they have the worse working conditions when we observe different indicators comparing men and women.
For the case of Venezuela, we have let's say also very good statistics in terms of participation of women as journalists. We have more than half, exactly 52% of women acting as journalists, which is very good. And let's say it's not surprising because most of the students in the bachelor degrees in Venezuela are also women. In fact, when you look at the data from the universities, we are talking about 65 to 70% of female students. So what is really surprising is that after studying journalists, many women do not go to work as a journalist. So that is a very interesting thing to analyze. The second thing is that, similar to many of the other countries in Latin America, the main safety concern that journalists had was related to the hate speech attacks or verbal attacks, hostility. And it was similar in Venezuela. Probably just it did exist in the past, just that people are more aware right now about these verbal attacks, about the language they use. And when we analyze the gender differences between all the safety variables, we saw that most of the variables were higher for men, except for those related to sexual harassment and workplace bullying. So, as I said, these variables were related to hate speech, but also to other kind of bad experiences, such as public discrediting or surveillance or detentions, and all these kind of things were more related to the perception that men had. But the two that I mentioned about sexual harassment and workplace bullying was to women, and that is something that is kind of interesting in terms of how traditional it is, because we can see that in other professions too. We see this as a structural problem that unfortunately we haven't really covered in the country. And finally, we didn't find any difference between the income in women and men, which is a good news. But we did find that the positions the women usually take are lower than men, which is the bad news, because they are just being paid for the same thing that men do, just that do it in lower positions. So that's about the gender disparities in Venezuela.
Thank you, Carlos. We have about maybe 6 or 7 minutes before I want to open up the floor for questions from people who are watching the webinar. But I wanted to ask just if each of you could briefly talk about, this is really an unprecedented collaborative effort. And obviously, we're very thankful to all the journalists who participated in the research. And many of us ourselves have been journalists. And so, and then went into academia. So, what can we do as academics to support journalists? In some ways, this is something that we can do to give back, having a webinar like this. But what else can we do? Maybe we can start with Summer and then go around the table here.
Thank you. I think that, one of the things that we do here at the Knight Center is we try to make sure that any kind of research that is being done about journalism makes it into the hands of the journalists, because too often the journalists themselves aren't getting that research that's being done. That being said, I think that we need to think about what role do we as academics have to play in informing policymakers. Obviously, we need public policies that address, so many of these issues that we've been talking about, right? The legal and safety vulnerabilities that journalists face, especially when it comes to surveillance, transparency, information access, et cetera. So it would be great maybe if we could see more digital security and safety training that universities could do, perhaps in partnership with NGOs, creating more, open access research summaries. At the Knight Center, we have a tab on our website for research, and we try and put resources on there for journalists who are interested, or policymakers, anybody really, who's interested in learning about the journalism across Latin America that's being done, or not just in Latin America, but about Latin American journalism and press freedom. Maybe we could think about just developing more mental health resources, partnering with newsrooms, especially for things like AI literacy and ethics. And again, these are things that we've been trying to do at the Knight Center, but I think that this needs to be a region-wide effort and international effort, right? Bringing in regions outside of Latin America as well, so that we can really try and provide that evidence-based advocacy that supports journalist safety and well-being.
I second wholeheartedly what Summer said. In addition to that, as I was talking about the roles of journalists and supporting people to engage in political participation, especially right now when democracy is being attacked or weakened in several of our countries in the region. It looks like it's a trend that have more authoritarian or authoritarian types emerging. I think it would be also important to find forms in addition of training, in addition to security in general, especially digital security, more training in how to journalists could be helpers or perform this role of supporting more civic engagement in the region. That doesn't mean that you're going to take a side, and I'm sorry that I have to, clarify that, but civic engagement means participation. It doesn't mean that you're going to take a side. And supporting training of journalists in that area, I think it would be very, very important. So collaborations with maybe across departments within universities or across universities with political science or other majors. So the evidence says that we need to support journalists in those areas.
Mireya, did you have something to add?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think this World of Journalism in general is one of the first very comprehensive studies of journalists in the world. We have 75 countries, and well, I think that's going to be one of the main legacies. Like, we are going to leave the whole database of surveys for everyone to use, and journalists can learn from this data about their challenges and compare their country with other countries. And in the specific case of Bolivia, um, and in other countries like Mexico, we had to elaborate our own media directories in order to sample journalists. And these directories are sometimes more up to date than the institutional ones. And I think this helps provide a baseline that did not exist before. So as academics, I think our most immediate give back is, at least in Bolivia, the media directory of 760 outlets that we created for this study, from ensembling various directories and making this data accessible to professional associations. I think will help them better understand the scale and diversity of their own industry. We can bridge the gap also by integrating these real-world findings into university curricula, because our 71% of our professionals are already seeking safety training. I think, as my colleague said, universities should partner with newsrooms to provide more workshops, and in Bolivia, at least, on ethical reporting in polarized contexts. So the next generation of journalists is not just academically prepared, but also street smart. And in the case of Bolivia, collaboration should also focus on solving the diversity crisis. Academia can lead research into why indigenous representation is so low, 10%, and provide media owners with data-driven strategies for more inclusive hiring. We can act as consultants for their industry, and academia can help the profession evolve so it better reflects the society it reports on. And we can also finally serve as an objective mediator in Bolivia's polarized landscape. We can host more webinars and forums like this one. We can provide more neutral spaces for journalists from across the political spectrum to discuss their shared professional challenges. Fortunately, in Bolivia, the peer support is high, the professional associations for journalists is also high, but I believe more could be done to bridge this gap between existing political narratives to more professional solidarity, because I think this is perhaps the most valuable contribution that we can make.
If I can add something, because we had valuable insights here. I wrote three main aspects I think that are very important, besides training to journalists since the first semester, not just on resilience, but also on how to manage teams in a more educated way and diverse way, because what I see that in research and also within news organizations, we have a lot of small violations, human rights violations that we cannot gather in this type of survey, and happens as normalized practices and routines of journalism. And it's very important to discuss it since the first semester, and discuss it from the ethical perspective, from a management perspective, and also how to empower journalists to protect themselves, especially those who are considered minority in newsrooms, because this is something that is still understudied. And I am sure that it has a huge impact in freedom of expression and democracies in our region and entire world. So this is something that I think that it's very important to do, and us as researchers, we could start providing the data, providing this information, trying to develop studies, bringing this type of data. Other thing that is the result of something I studied with a colleague of mine in the past, a small survey in Brazil, and we saw that safety issues that affect journalists also affect journalism educators. So journalism educators in Brazil and other parts of the world, they also are attacked. They are called indoctrinating peers people, parents attacks their lecturers, and even journalism students, they are attacked when they are doing their own practical activities. This is something that also we need to think about, maybe research and also offer trainings, as the colleagues offered a lot of insights on how to do that. And and I am talking it because I am a former journalist who left the newsroom trying to make a change. Then I have this double role that I am a researcher here, but I think as an advocate trying to improve things. And then I think this type of study is initial step, but we should use this data to really try to connect with other organizations that could promote a real change in the field.
Just in my case, I think this study is not only sociological, it's also about journalism practice. It's important that the results of this study contribute to the awareness of journalists about what are the real limitations and constraints they have. I'm talking especially about some countries such as Venezuela that can be related to other authoritarian countries in which the perception of journalists sometimes about their own job is a kind of different from what we have from abroad. And sometimes what we have found is something called that we can call the journalistic Stockholm syndrome, because I mean I've been once in an authoritarian country in the Arab world, and they say here we don't have any fake news. We're happy because of that. We only have one news because they only have one truth, right? So they were happy with that when I was teaching there. Something similar is happening in Venezuela. Some of the journalists they haven't realized completely what are the real constraints or limitations in terms of safety and precariousness and precarity that they have in their everyday job. So just our study could also contribute to helping journalists to in these countries to realize about these conditions, how these conditions really affect the work that they do.
These are all wonderful ideas, and I hope that we can put some of them into practice. I want to get to the audience questions, and we won't be able to answer them all, but we certainly will keep track of all of your questions. So I want to thank everyone putting their questions in the chat. And we had several people who were interested in international collaborations or collaborations among journalists across different countries in the region. And I know this maybe not was a specific focus of the World of Journalism study, but you all have some have done research in the region and maybe can speak to that, the importance of international collaborations, or if we even found that in the study and the surveys that you did. Lourdes, did you want to talk and take that question first?
Yes. I hope I remember correctly, but I don't think we have questions about collaborations in the survey. I have done research though about collaboration in Latin America through the Knight Center. And so we found that collaboration, it's a small part of newsrooms who work in collaborations, and this is 2020, 2022. Things have been changing rapidly. The paper we work on, or the research we did with the Knight Center, was because part sprung from the Panama Papers, which was a big collaboration. There were several countries and newsrooms from South America and Latin America in general which participated in the project. At the time of our research, again 5 years ago or so, still international or transnational collaboration was relatively small compared to among investigative journalists. But there was a very important motivation among the ones who participated, and they said it was because of the development of transnational topics that they wanted to cover. Of course, organized crime, Lava Jato, things like that were happening at the time. And so that was a big motivation to participate. But there were other reasons, many of them related to environmental issues. We share many things in the countries, and there was a high motivation to participate. I think someone on the chat asked about skills. One of the hypothesis that we had coming to do that research was the younger journalists were the ones who would have the better skills because they were more digitally savvy. And that hypothesis turned out to be null. So it was our preconceptions were wrong. It was actually middle-aged, older journalists who had been doing more investigative research, who were more savvy in terms of how to participate in these transnational collaborations, because they had the background, they had the experience, and they were able to translate to that, to these transnational, international collaborations. So the other reason to collaborate was also that because the collaboration helped the group. And so the group made the journalists and the journalists work stronger and safer for them. So that's the paper, it's called Stronger and Safer Together, actually. And because they saw that by participating with larger newsrooms or more newsrooms outside their country, they were going to get more attention to the problems they wanted to report, and that group would protect them. And so, yes, there is a lot of interest in the region to participate. There are skills, and from 5 years to now, I would say that there are probably more savviness and lots of newsrooms that participate. The majority are digital. Maybe Summer can talk a little bit about that. Digital natives newsrooms are the ones that are probably participate the most, but mainstream and traditional newsrooms are also participating.
Yeah, just to piggyback really quick, the digital native news sites, so many of them consider themselves to be transnational. El Faro in El Salvador is a good example of this, right? That they cover Central America as a region, even though there's a Salvadoran site, although technically now they're located outside, right? Their business is incorporated in Costa Rica. All of the journalists themselves or most of them are operating from exile. And I think that that's a new level of transnational cooperation that we have to think about now, is with journalists from Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, some from Mexico, going into exile, whether it's because there is no more press freedom in their countries, like in Nicaragua, and like is starting to be in El Salvador, where being a journalist is essentially criminalized, or starting to be, then that's when they're going to have to be reporting from outside of their country. And how do you do that? Journalism looks very different. So transnational journalism, that cooperation takes on a whole new sense of urgency and looks very different in practice than what so many of these sites had been doing in terms of transnational journalism, right? Because now they themselves are located transnationally, if you will.
Yeah, just similar in Venezuela that just Summer mentioned, but we have a lot of journalists in exile that are covering local news, let's say, and this is just because of the censorship, the informative blackout, and all that. So, for the case of Venezuela, even if we didn't include these questions in our survey, it was crucial for the way they inform or they report the international cooperations with other journalists. The only difference is that the focus of this international cooperation was a national one. So they want to, for example, main TV channels in Colombia cover the news in Venezuela more than the Venezuelan newspapers or the Venezuelan TV channels, or it's happening with other countries too, like the U.S. and Spain, that they have specialized media that covers Venezuelan news. So that is in that term, Venezuelan case is very similar in terms of international cooperation.
May I say something about the question that if we are not concerned about the lack of representation of trans and gender non-conforming journalists.
Yes, go ahead.
It's
I'm
there
glad you
from
brought that up.
it's there from Danielle Cruz. And I think she's absolutely right. We should be concerned about this. The thing is, we question in the survey, which was the same for the 76 countries, we have gender at the end. It was like one of the last questions, and we had to fill what is your gender, female, male, or other. So by the time that question was asked, like journalists were very tired, and that was probably one of the reasons we should be asking this at first, that, like it should be the first question. But then, for example, in Mexico, we did have 4.4% of journalists who identify as a sexual minority. Sorry, but I'm part of Mexico as well. I know we are not discussing Mexico today. And that is very similarly to the actual Mexican population. But you had to actually ask whether you identify as some cultural or minority, and which one, and that's when 4.4% of the respondents in Mexico said LGBT people. So while in the case of Mexico, it is mostly aligns with the overall population. Of course, there is a representation, and the most worrying part is that for the case of hate speech, it is not women the most likely to be verbally attacked, but sexual minorities, and sexual minorities is always a strong predictor of digital violence and of hate speech. So attackers attack journalists for who they are, and not only for their visibility or for their profession. And I think that's striking, and we should be aiming to have more diversity policies in newsrooms to protect our sexual minorities in the newsrooms. But of course, we are shocked.
Yeah,
Thank
may
you,
I
Mireya. Yes, Janara, did
No,
you want
just
to add?
in the Brazilian case, this is a concern we had because we couldn't reach these people. We tried as our best, and we believe that or they are not represented in the newsrooms, the main newsrooms, and we cannot receive have these answers, or we need to find another approaches to do this type of research. So this is a concern that at least I think that all of us, but in Brazil we have it because I participated in this survey, in another big survey that were the Brazilian journalist profile with more than 7,000 answers. And the number of people non-heteronormative or people who are non-white people, we see it's lowest than we expected. And then it's something that we see that this type of study maybe cannot reach this population, and we need to improve, because it's very important, especially to see those small, not small, but the violations that happens, and they just seem as part of the job, something that's normalized, and it's hidden in the practices and routines in the newsrooms.
Yes, it's something that I think we will continue to talk about. And just when we think about this kind of research done across a region and across the world, we took great lengths and talked many times about just how to word questions, thinking about the different regionalizations, about the language. So it's something that I think that we can continue to talk about. And for the next round, this was an unprecedented effort, of course. And so we will be doing this again in a few years. And we'll definitely take all of these comments that you put in the chat to heart, and strengthening the work that we're doing. With that, I'm sorry to say that we're out of time. And so I want to thank everybody who attended the webinar. I want to thank our distinguished panelists. Thank you for your insights and expertise on these important countries, and encourage everyone also to go to the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas to download the ebook in English, Spanish, or Portuguese, or all three if you're interested. And I'm going to toss things back to Summer to close us out. Thanks again.
Just thank you again, Celeste, for leading this great discussion. Thank you to Mireia, Lourdes, Janara, and Carlos, and then all of the people who attended. I put the links again to the ebook in the chat, as well as links to last week's or week before last webinar that we held about this ebook as well, but with other countries, and it was held in Spanish. So all of these resources are available to everyone on the Knight Center's website. So please be sure and check it out. And thank you again, and stay tuned for what we have coming up next. I'm sure we'll let y'all know. So thanks again and have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.